Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another event hosted by the Language Collaboratory, a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue on the teaching of languages and cultures, driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, University of Michigan, University of Minnesota, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Let me share my screen while we're doing this. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional learning opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions. Our series this spring aims at furthering conversations that help uncover the complexities of striking a balance on professional, academic, and personal goals to achieve the well-being of instructors and students of languages. We address this issue through the lens of our current experience, our current shared circumstances, approaching it from a variety of perspectives, building on the experiences and expertise of individuals on our own campuses. We aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging the institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You are invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion. The sessions will be recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset, that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat, and during the open discussion period, to raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning is available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Our next event will be held 1 week from today on February 22nd at this time, hosted by the University of Minnesota and discussing collaborative online intentional learning. Today's host is the University of Iowa, and I turn the floor over to Claire Francis, Director of the Center for Language and Culture Learning at the University of Iowa. Claire?
Thanks, Dan. I'm really excited to welcome my colleague Kristine Munoz here today. I'm very excited that she was able to get into the Zoom by the seat of her pants, or just in the nick of time. Kristine is going to talk to us today. Maybe Dan, you want to stop sharing? We can do a gallery. Yeah, there. Today about work-life balance in our profession, we're going to start by talking a bit about what you think are the barriers to balancing work and life in academia in general, to start with, Kristine.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the chance to talk about this. This has been something that has been of passionate interest to me for a very long time. I had both of my children when I was in graduate school, and they are now in their 30s. So this is something that has never been far from my mind during all of that time. The barriers that I have seen that get in the way of balancing work and life I'll talk about 3 very briefly. One is there's a Puritan ideology in this country that your worth is measured by how hard you work, and that what work looks like for academics is not what work looks like for other kinds of labor. At least that was the case when I went home from college and later graduate school, and later even as a professor, that in my family of origin, sitting still was not working. So if I was reading, or if I was writing, or later on if I were sitting in front of a computer, it didn't look to my mother like I was working. So sitting still did not look like working, and I had to keep doing things to convince the people around me that I was working. And I got into a habit of working longer and longer hours just to prove to an invisible audience that I was working. And I think we can all get sucked into that idea that there's always somebody watching us to see if we're really working, and looking over our shoulders to see if what we're doing is actually working. Add to that a spirit of competition that academics tend to talk about, I have a lot on my plate right now. The plate metaphor, I think, has sometimes taken over discourse among academics. And there are numbers, I can't count how many times I've heard people talk about working 80-hour weeks. And that is one that I just don't believe. I don't think anybody works productively 80 hours a week. If there are people who spend 80 hours a week at an office, I can believe that. I can't believe that they're productive for more than about 40 of those hours. I don't know what they're doing with the rest of them, but human beings have only so many hours a day or a week that they can be productive. But if somebody tells you that they work 80 hours a week and you say, oh my goodness, I don't work nearly that many hours, it kind of sticks in your head and you think, maybe I'm not working hard enough. Those are kind of two negative barriers to separating or balancing work and life. There's one very positive barrier, and that is most of us love the work we do, and we love it so much that it's hard to put it down. And a lot of the work we do feels like fun. And the problem is that as much fun as it is also work. And if you don't learn how to put it down, if you don't learn how to balance work with life, it will burn you out and it will start to feel not like fun and not even like work. It will start to feel like torture. So those are three barriers I would point to.
I'm sure that resonates with every single person in this Zoom right now, is that idea of that culture of busyness. And I think you've really identified the Puritan work ethic as being at the root of a lot of this. I know I've been guilty in my former life, especially, of just buying into that. And it's also resonating with me right now because I'm in a webinar called Getting Things Done, which is all about productivity. And I feel like, oh, I think I get enough done, but that's great. What about barriers that are specific to the language teaching profession? Can you identify any of those for us?
Yes. Language teachers, I don't know a single one of us that went into this for the money. Language teachers do this for love, not for money. And once you've taken the vow of poverty that goes with being a language teacher, it becomes harder to back off and remember that there are ways to take time completely off that are unrelated to the job they're paying you to do. You can watch a movie that is not for your class. You can read a book that isn't for practicing your language. You can go somewhere on vacation that is not a professional conference. You can unplug completely from the identity and the work of being a language teacher. And not only can you, you really need to. You really need to unplug from that identity on a regular basis. Another factor unique to language teachers is that we tend to have small classes, and we also have very intensive courses oftentimes. We'll have courses that meet more than the usual 3 hours a week. Sometimes I imagine we've all taught courses that met 5 or more hours a week, so that we have a lot of contact with the same group of students during a week. Over the course of 3 weeks, we take them on study abroad trips. We get to know them very well. Often will have the same student in several classes over the course of their college career. And so we develop closer relationships with language students than um, teachers do in other disciplines. Before I came into Spanish and Portuguese, I was in a Department of Communication Studies, and most of my classes had 150 to 250 students. And I can tell you the relationships with those students were very different. Obviously, I was lucky if I knew 20 of them by name. And I certainly did not have the kind of close relationships that I value very much in Spanish classes now. And this is the joy of being a language teacher. And it's also one of the big reasons it's very hard to turn it off and strike a balance. The other day I've been meeting individually with every student who's in my asynchronous online class. And I did that because I wanted to know them personally. I did not want it to be just a list of faceless names on an enrollment sheet. And it's one thing to make that kind of time commitment, but I found myself also making a list of promises to some of those students, from sending them a link to a podcast that I thought they would benefit from hearing, to introducing them to possible job contacts. It's going to take me hours to follow up on this list. Now, this is the best part of the job for me, which it goes back to we love the work we do. But it adds a whole new dimension, not just to the time involved, but the energy above and beyond the preparation for class, the teaching, the grading, and the office hours. Related to that, language departments tend to be small and intimate relational ecosystems. There may not be a lot of turnover for decades. So you spend a lot of your adult life in a really interdependent group of academics. We have to coordinate very closely around things that we're very invested in, like curriculum, reading lists, policies about how to support at-risk students. Those both extend the workday and involve a lot of emotional energy. So it goes beyond whether we like these colleagues or we don't, and that probably varies from one day and one year to the next. It's a very intense set of relationships that it gets more and more difficult, sometimes impossible, to shut the office door and leave it behind us. And I'll get to suggestions on how to shut the door on that in just a minute. And finally, teaching online has affected everybody by making it harder to separate our workspace from our home space. And a lot of studies show that everybody works more hours when we work from home. It's harder than ever to turn it off if you're walking from the workstation in one corner of your dining room to the dining room table in the other corner, instead of across campus to get on a bus, to listen to your iPod on the way home, and then walk several blocks through the change of seasons to get home. So as hard as it all has been to for language teachers to balance work and life before, it's gotten that much harder as our students' needs have increased. And now we're talking to them from our homes, and they're talking to us from their homes.
Yeah, I think you're really alluding to, I think a few points back, is really the emotional labor that foreign language faculty really put in, and probably do a lot more of that. I think there's some research on this than faculty in other disciplines, and in terms of like being connected with students as often as they need, and for needs that we might not be prepared to even help them with sometimes. And so that would also affect that work-life balance, I think. I think it's a good time for you to get to us to those strategies that you're alluding to. It's like, what would be your strategies for developing a better attitude or developing, coping with work-life balance issues?
Okay, some things that have worked for me. I mean, everybody talks about keeping boundaries, and that's always easier said than done. But something I read a long time ago that really helped was to recognize that boundaries involve time, energy, mind, and spirit, and that you have to keep all four of those. You have to take all four of those very seriously. So, the first one I always do is no matter what is happening, sometime Friday afternoon, I turn email off and I do not turn it back on until sometime Sunday afternoon. And I tell students that I'm sorry, whatever's happening in their lives, I am not going to look at email. You'll all organize your days and your weeks differently, but I just do not look at email during that part of the weekend. I also do not do email in the evenings. And it took me a while to get to a point where I wasn't at least peaking, but I have never had email on my phone because I just can't be available that much of the time. I have learned to, when it comes to downtime, I learned to separate real downtime, things that actually do nourish my energy and refresh and renew me, from time wasting that actually doesn't leave me refreshed and renewed. I call it false friends and real renewal. So the things that really do renew and refresh me, and again, this will be different for everybody, but for me, there's a big difference if I knit in front of a good movie or a good TV series versus when I flip channels and nosh popcorn. One of them leaves me a new person, and the other just leaves me kind of sick. There's exploring something that's really worth reading on the computer versus doom scrolling Twitter and Facebook. So it's okay if I'm in front of a screen under certain circumstances. That can be kicking back and relaxing, but I need to be mindful of what it is I'm doing on those screens. The relationships that I have to get a break from. Some people are better than I am about having a social network outside of work. I've gotten better about that over the years, but a friend of mine said that her husband used to say, "Now, I want everyone from your department out of my dining room, gone. They are not welcome at my dining room table. Who can we invite instead?" So he said, all those people you work with are not here anymore, meaning that they were not going to talk about work, her work. They were going to talk about their children. They were going to talk about the people whose books they were reading. They were going to talk about the podcast they were listening to. They were going to talk about family members, but only those that weren't driving them more crazy than their colleagues. So she had a spouse who really helped keep her from inviting the tense relationships from work home with her. Putting a high priority on who and what will outlast your work, whatever that is. When my children were small and I was seeking tenure, at times it drove me a little frantic to see how much of my time and energy I felt like they were sucking up. But then I would say, these two little kids do not care whether I get tenure or not. 6, 7 years from now, they are still going to be here and they are going to love me just as much, whether I have tenure or not. And that was a real boon to shutting off the incessant pressure that I was feeling, and say they are never going to be this size again. I mean, thank God. But it really, whatever it is that's going to outlast your work, whether that's a partner, a child, a church, family, animals, community work, whatever it is. And if you look around and there isn't anything that's going to outlast your work, you might want to give some thought to finding something like that. So those are my suggestions.
So
I'm
to
sure you have
reiterate,
other ideas.
that was time, energy, mind, and spirit. Those are
Yeah,
your
the boundaries.
the
Yeah.
boundaries that you need to set. That's great. Thank you. Those are fantastic suggestions. Certainly, I think, just the first step in cutting off that email after 5 o'clock or on the weekend and making sure that you're guarding your private time to yourself is so important. And then resourcing yourself with the energy that you need, and identifying those energies that make you happy. And I think it's so funny that knitting but not eating popcorn is your energizer, whereas I'm a popcorn addict, so popcorn for me. I think it would be a great idea to open this up to the floor to see if anybody wanted to share some of their strategies for finding this kind of balance, and if this resonates with you, or if you have comments, or feel free to pop in. Oh, there's a question in the chat before anybody else drops in, is how do you eliminate the feeling of guilt that comes with the restrictions on your time, etc.? If you have any ideas on that, Kristine, or
I
anyone.
do. I heard a wonderful metaphor for this, and that is on airplanes, they tell you if you are sitting with someone who needs assistance with their oxygen mask, put your own mask on first and then help the person sitting next to you. So I always say, I have to put my own oxygen mask on first, or I cannot help the person next to me. So if a student needs me on email on a Saturday, I'm sorry, I have to put my own oxygen mask on first. And I say that constantly. That's one of my mantras.
Our Georgian colleague, Katya, says that she teaches on Saturdays in Georgia, and it's a never-ending process. Can't get a break.
That's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard. Is there any day off in Georgia?
Feel free to jump in if you wanted to, Katya. Oh, Sundays. Sundays are off.
Yeah, I would turn everything off on Sundays and devote that day completely to myself, and also look for when is there an hour that can be mine. When I was an administrator, I had much more encroachment on my time than I do now, and so I had to settle for smaller blocks of time, but the principle was the same. It was, this hour is mine, and nobody comes in the door, and I'm not looking at email, and I'm not answering the phone. So if Sunday is the one day, then I'm not looking at anything on that day.
Kristine, how does grading fit into all of this? Because
I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, I remember that being a big time sink when I was teaching, and it took up all my Sunday and most of my evenings. And of course, there was course prep.
Grading I would say grading takes up more time than any other part of teaching. And I have learned some very good ways to do that in ways that I feel are thorough enough that I'm doing the students right. but also don't take so long. And I would kind of need to write that down and send it to you. One of them I'll try to describe briefly. If I have 20 papers, I read about 5 or 6 or 7 of them without making any comments. And I say, I think there are 3 main kinds of problems students are having with the assignment. And then I write the 3 main problems, and then I copy and paste those 3 main problems so that I'm not writing it over and over and over again. This is using the speed grader function that we have. So I'm grading all of this by computer, so I'm not writing it by hand. But that is one very big time saver I use. And then in class, I talk about what the common problems were, and I talk about, I give advice on how to solve each of the 3 or 4 main problems. And then if there's a student or 2 that has a particular unique problem, then I encourage them to see me individually. And then of course it's on them whether they do or not. And unfortunately, many times they choose not to.
Is there any, it occurs to me that students don't really have great work-life balance either. And is there any way, I mean, and I think modeling this is extremely important as they are becoming young adults and are going to go out into the quote unquote real world, such as it is. But is there any way that you can be, or if anybody has any thoughts on being intentional about telling students to check out and to stop and to set those boundaries for themselves?
Other people have thoughts? I don't want to dominate.
We have a thought in the chat about homework coming in on Google Docs, and that makes it easier. But that was the previous topic. Anybody have any ideas on like how to encourage students to really set boundaries for themselves as well? Dan's got an idea.
Well, I think one thing you could do is just as we heard last week, tell the students how you create boundaries for yourself and suggest that they think along the same lines or similar lines.
I think it's important also, Kristine's example of being in front of the television and knitting and finding energy from that. I think that's that's a great story for students, because I feel like sometimes I behave like a 20-year-old because I'm doom scrolling all the time, or I'm on TikTok or other social media. And I think that is such a time sink that makes them feel incredibly guilty, but it's also this quote unquote guilty pleasure. And it's a form of them getting energy, but I don't think it's the kind of resourcing energy that Kristine was speaking of, right? So it's like, it's the equivalent of eating the popcorn and not feeling sick, right? That's what's happening to them. But I think if you have a conversation with them about how there might be some other activity to engage in that would make them feel good.
Somehow they seem very surprised when I tell them I spend way too much time on Twitter and Facebook. And that leads us to a conversation about left to my own devices, I would while away hours on Twitter and Facebook. But the ill effects of that are that the hours go by and I'm just depressed and more tired than I was before. And I could really do a lot better if I slept, or if I exercised, and that's when I say, or I watched a really good movie on Netflix, because they often equate Netflix and chill with any other form of relaxation. And I say a good movie on Netflix, that's a good story that kind of feeds something in my mind, whereas flipping through Twitter is just exhausting. It's just and it saps mental energy instead of giving me mental energy. And I am not a cognitive scientist, but I think there's something to the idea that um, the focusing on one thing instead of skipping around is going to help. That's a more helpful form of relaxation.
I'm gonna thank you so much. This has really been a very thought-provoking half hour, and it's been just delightful to hear from you. And I'm delighted you were able to get in and share your insights with us. I love that concept of just being very consistent about blocking off your time and being upfront about that from the get-go. I think that's really important. I just wanted to say our time is up, and we are happy to stick around for another 10 minutes or so for informal conversation, but we're going to stop the recording now.